Well, welcome back from fall break. We're going to finish off the series on friendship called How to Friend. And I love this topic because it's just, it's so incredibly important, not just for your stage of life, although it's incredibly important and pertains to your stage of life in particular, but this applies through the rest of your life in all age groups. But I remember when I was a little kid, I had one best friend named Kyle, who he and I were literally, we were good friends from like 4 years old, like preschool, all the way through like our senior year of high school. We were best friends all throughout the different awkward phases of growing up where you like discover yourself in different ways and have like, you know, you go through the awkward middle school stage, right? Where, you know, you're starting to look like a young adult, but also a kid. And some people, their voice hasn't dropped. Some people, it's just an awkward season. Can we agree middle school's awkward, right? How many of you look back on your middle school pictures and you're like, oh no, delete, and you try to delete it off of the face of social media forever. But even through all that, Kyle and I remained good friends. And so it's still to this day, we're good friends. We don't talk as often because states apart, but he and I have a lifelong friendship that started when we were 4 years old. Okay. With the exception of Kyle, every one of my other friendships, all growing up, changed. Like I didn't have consistent friendship. I had seasons of friends where the groups of friends would change. I had another friend named Zach who he and I were really close when we were young. We'd call each other the Zach Attack because it was pretty cool. We thought we were clever, but we would hang out a lot when we were younger. And by the time we reached like 4th, 5th, 6th grade, going into middle school, we really weren't that close anymore. And even though we were still at the same school for a while, and then eventually he moved on to a different school, and we didn't keep in touch. But I had other friends, you know, that I was close to for seasons of time, and whether it was they were my neighbor or like we were at church around the same times, because back then, you know, there was, you know, first hour where only the old people came to service, and then there was like the Sunday school hour. But there was also church service you could go to, and then there was church service again, and then there was Sunday night home groups, and there was Wednesday midweeks, and so like all the church things that you had friends like that you were together because you were with each other like several times throughout the week at church related events, and then you know, the friends like at school every day or on sports, those all shifted throughout the seasons, and so I was close to some people at some points in time and others at other points in time. And like 99% of the time, it was not because of any kind of ill will or bitter feelings towards each other. It was just the reality that friendships change. Can we all agree, like, friendships change over time? Like, how many of you have, like, most of your friends that are your friends now have been friends since you were, like, 4 or younger? Anybody? Okay. How many of you, like, a lot of your friends, most of your friends are not friends that you've had your entire life? Okay, so the majority of you get what I'm saying here, right? Sometimes, you know, sometimes friendships change because of different seasons. Sometimes there are hard feelings over friendships dissolving, but a good life skill maybe would be what to do when it's time to unfriend. What do you do when it's time to move on from a friendship, whether consciously or subconsciously? And how do we address some of those tensions, especially as Christians when we want to be friendly with everybody? And how do you do that without hurting people's feelings and all that kind of stuff? Because people change, their hobbies change, their likes, their interests, those change. Maybe your schedules change. Maybe you change schools, you change locations. So all throughout growing up, things change in your lives, and they don't always converge with the people you were once close to. And so naturally, you kind of stop being friends with some people. And sometimes, again, it's intentional. Sometimes it's not. Maybe it was because you switched schools, it made it difficult to keep in touch. Maybe it was because schedules changed, and maybe while you're still at the same school, it's a big building, so you don't really ever cross paths anymore. Maybe something else, maybe you just, again, changed interests, and you just don't have that much in common anymore than you did when your parents used to hang out when you were little, and then so by default, you guys would hang out. You know, things change, and sometimes it can be difficult. Sometimes it can be rather simple. Sometimes it's like if I were to have a shoe up here, and I just like, sometimes your friendships are just, as you get older, it's really easy. They just come untied, and you just kind of, you're not really friends anymore, and you both go separate ways, and it's not too bad. Other times, you have friendships that are like, your lives are interwoven like in multiple different ways, and so you have like this whole knot of a friendship that like no matter how hard you try to untie it, it's like your lives are so intertwined that to unfriend that person would mean it's going to be awkward at church, it's going to be awkward at school, it's going to be awkward when your parents hang out because your parents are still in the same small group at church, and you can't just untie that friendship all willy-nilly like you could before. And so you got to kind of sit there and work and, okay, how am I going to be nice to them when I have to be around them at these classes, and how am I going to not rip their head off when they do that subtle, not so subtle dig at me in front of other people, and how do I slowly get my way out of this friendship that I no longer think is healthy for me to be in. And so some relationships are that way, where it's much more difficult to just stop hanging out with them, and then other relationships are much easier. And so what do you do when your lives are interwoven with somebody and it's just not the easiest to detach from, even if it's probably healthier for you if you detach from that person? Chelsea always makes fun of the way I tie my shoes, but I've tied my shoes the exact same way since I was like 5. Was that weird? Seriously? I thought it was like the most normal thing. How do you guys tie your shoes? Okay, so side note, super easy. So you do the typical that everybody does. You just, okay? Hold it in place so it doesn't come loose. Make loop 1, bunny ear 1, right? Around it and pull through. Takes like 2 seconds. I don't do the 2 bunny ear thing. That's too complicated. That's basically what I did. Anyway, okay, so I think we proved my point that I tie my shoes like a normal person. So we're going to move on from that distraction. But you get what I'm saying, right? You know, I should have thought that through before I did it and was made fun of. I suddenly got self-conscious as I was doing it because Chelsea tells me that I do it weird. And maybe I do. I do a lot of things weird, but we're going to move on. So you get what I'm saying. Sometimes friendships are complicated. Sometimes they're not complicated. Sometimes you naturally drift apart. Sometimes it takes a little more work and effort on your end to kind of untangle the weave you have woven together in that relationship. And so how do you unfriend in a loving way, in a Christian way, in a way that's as least hurtful as possible? Because we all understand sometimes that needs to happen. Sometimes it's not so cut and dry. Maybe you had a friend that you have differing opinions about, and they're like strong opinions about pretty important, pivotal things in your life, like your faith or lack thereof. And those differences just rear their ugly heads every time you're around each other. And so it just maybe instead of one of you changing in the friendship itself just changed. Or maybe you had a friend who hurt you with their words or their actions, and so to be honest with those hurt feelings, it just made it really convenient for you to want to kind of untie yourself from that friendship. And maybe it was the other way around. Maybe you hurt them or did something that made them feel like they couldn't be around you and have a good time. Maybe you had a friend who started walking just a different path altogether. They stopped doing the things that you know they should do, and if you hang out with them, you know you're probably going to get in trouble. And so you have to make some kind of conscious decisions about, am I going to spend time with this person? Even though I like this person, I've been friends with this person, if I know that they're probably going to get me into trouble or do things that I'm uncomfortable with when I'm around them. And so there's various reasons why you might feel like you need to unfriend somebody. So how do we do that? How do we do that well? Many friendships, and if you ask any of the adults in the room, they'll be able to confirm this for you. Many friendships are seasonal. Many friendships last for a season, and that's okay. You both, maybe God put you together for such a time as this, where you needed each other for a particular thing you're going through. And maybe that creates some bonds that are lifelong, but you don't necessarily hang out every day like you used to, right? And that's okay. That's good. Maybe there's friendships that you have a friendship with them because you just sit next to each other in like biology, and so oftentimes you get partnered up for lab or whatever it is, and kind of hit it off and see your friends, but then maybe next year you're not so close with them, and that's fine. Some friends are seasonal. But the reality of life and relationships is that friendships have the potential to change for the better or the worse. Sometimes they change for the better because you're able to build each other up, and so friends that you kind of really didn't think about as like close friends for a while become close friends because of other friendships changing. Or you connect on a deeper level at an event or at a CIY or something like that. Or maybe there's friendships that changed again for the worst because you found that every time you were with them, they weren't bringing out the best version of yourself. And deep down you knew that. And so that friendship needed to change. So if relationships are bound to change, if people change, that means their friendships and relationships will often change. If a lot of friendships are only seasonal, then how do we do this right? That's a fair question, right? How do we do this right? We don't want to hurt people's feelings, but we also want to do what's best for us at the same time. So we're going to look through a passage in the Bible that honestly, have anybody ever done like a deep dive through the book of Acts in the New Testament? If you haven't, I encourage you to do so. There's tons of resources online I could point you to that'll make it easy for you to kind of walk through. But basically, it's the sequel to the Gospels. So the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the life and ministry of Jesus at the very beginning of the New Testament, right? It's kind of where Christianity begins, with the life of Jesus. And then Luke writes his gospel, right? And he's not a Jew, so he was a physician, he was a doctor. He's writing as an analytically minded person who didn't grow up religious, came to faith in Jesus, and chronicled the life of Christ in his gospel. And then Acts is like Luke 2. It's like right where the book of Luke ended, the book of Acts begins. So it begins with Jesus giving the Great Commission and ascending back into heaven. And then where Jesus says, I give you power to go and take my spirit and take my teachings, take my gospel, take everything that I have shown you and given to you and give it to the rest of the world. Okay, we're going to change the face of the planet by the love of Jesus. And so Jesus gives that last commission to his disciples, and Peter preaches at Pentecost. 3,000 come to faith, and then the church is started. Right there. So the book of Acts is literally a history of the early church. And it follows for the first third of the book, the life of Peter and kind of those disciples. And then it kind of transitions around chapter 8 and 9 to Paul, who wrote the majority of the New Testament that we read today, or at least more than half of it, for sure. And he writes a lot of letters to the church. He goes on these missionary journeys, all of which are chronicled in the book of Acts. So you see when you read like Corinthians or Colossians or Ephesians, you see in those letters oftentimes where he was and where that corresponded to the book of Acts. So book of Acts is like a big picture, and then like all the letters he wrote was during that time. And so it's kind of cool. They all kind of fit together. They're historical events, the things that actually happen and document a real people at a real time. So this is what's happening. And where we're going to read today, we kind of have three main characters and then kind of a fourth that comes in. But we got Paul, we've got his buddy Barnabas, and then you have John Mark. Okay, John Mark was young and who kind of followed and was like kind of mentored by Paul. And he actually goes on to write the Gospel of Mark by using Peter as his main witness. And so if you didn't know that, the Gospel of Mark is from Peter's point of view, because he's informing John Mark here that we're going to read about in Acts on kind of his experience with Jesus. So it's kind of cool. It all kind of fits together that way. And then we're going to see Silas come in here into play in a minute. But Barnabas was kind of an encourager, and he was the one that also kind of helped fund their missionary journeys. He had the finances for it, and it cost money to travel. And so these guys were on a mission to spread the gospel, had been commissioned by Jesus to go and spread the gospel throughout the world at that time. That was all of Asia Minor. And so here we find in Acts chapter 15 that a little bit of a disagreement that happens between these brethren. And we think of like our heroes of the faith in the Bible, and we think they didn't struggle with the petty things we struggle with, right? But they were human too, and they had relational conflict as well. And so there's something we can learn from this. So we find in Acts chapter 15, starting verse 36, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, and this is while they're traveling around and stuff, he said, let's go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. In other words, let's go check on all those churches we planted. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. In other words, Paul looks at John Mark and he goes, I don't think he's super reliable. He kind of crapped out on us a while ago. Remember that? I don't think it'd be wise to take him with us. And obviously, Barnabas feels differently. He's like, no, I think you should give him another chance. I think he'd be good for it. Barnabas wants to bring him. Again, apparently he ditched them in the past. And because of that, Paul didn't want to bring him, which is understandable. You can kind of see both sides of this. It sounds like a lot of the conflicts we still have today with one another. But the fact that this story is included in the book of Acts is, to me, kind of evidence that this isn't made up, because especially back then when it was like expensive to document things down and have papyrus and write things, like, and especially as was custom, if you read like the biographies of the emperors at the time, who were the people that could actually afford to have biographies written about them, like they would always fluff it up. They would take the bad stuff out, and they would make themselves sound really good. If these were made up stories, you wouldn't see any of this interrelational conflict. You wouldn't see any of the stuff that kind of paints these people in a bad light kind of throughout. You see the raw and the real. You see the actual conflict they had. You see that even Paul was not perfect. Even the first missionaries were not perfect. And the people who actually saw and spoke with Jesus, they didn't have it all together. And so you see kind of an inside scoop on this thing. But check out what happens next. They had such a sharp disagreement that they, Paul and Barnabas, parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And what we find, especially as we keep reading, is both of them, they almost were able to double the work because they split off and went to separate ways. And because even though they had that disagreement, it seems by all indications they were able to kind of resolve it and know, you know what? Why don't you do that? You take John Mark, you believe in him, you go continue the work that way, I'll continue the work this way. So actually, I think the gospel was furthered through this conflict because they handled it in a Christ-like way. And they don't speak ill of each other when they go to these new places. They don't, it seemed to have very many bitter feelings towards each other, but they do have a sharp disagreement and they part ways. And this is back in a time where you can't just text each other to meet back up. This is like, it's going to take time to re-find each other if you decide to meet back up in the future. So you were saying goodbye to a traveling companion for a long time. And talk about friendships being seasonal. This is almost kind of putting an end to their friendship for the time being. But they're still able to continue the good work and do what is called of and required of them. And what I love about this is that, again, they both continue to do what they set out to do. And I think they were able to do it twice as fast because they split up. They could have let this conflict in their friendship and stop them. They could have let it impact the work that they knew they needed to do. And they could have stopped talking about Jesus and started talking trash about each other. But they didn't. And we can see the results for ourselves. Both Paul and Barnabas continued their work. And ultimately, what I want us to kind of glean from this as it pertains to our own lives is that being a friend means walking away friendly. When you have to walk away friendly. You don't have to bash the person behind their back. You don't have to just look at them with disgust when you are in the same room again. You can choose to be friendly. Even if you have hurt feelings, even if there's some other stuff going on, you can control you, and you can walk away friendly. You can still treat people with respect. You can speak well of them when their name comes up. You can move forward with your life just like they move forward with their lives. And I understand that this is easier said than done, but there's a key word here that happens, that needs to happen if this is going to happen well, and that word is forgive. When you have differences with people, we need to learn to forgive well. See, the world sees the way that we treat one another, and the way that we handle conflict is supposed to be different than the rest of the world that shouts at each other, that despises one another. We're called to love our enemies. And if a friend becomes an enemy, we're still called to love them, to pray for them. And so that's what separates us from anybody else, right? Even to quote the Bible, even pagans love one another, right? But Christians, we're supposed to even be loving to those who aren't loving towards us. So one, I want you to identify why you're frustrated if you're frustrated in friendship or frustrated with a person. Oh, what is it that is it your pain? Is it anger? Is it frustration? Identify what it is that you're feeling, because if you can identify it, then you can address it. Secondly, cancel their offense. That's essentially what we're talking about. To forgive them is to let it go. It might look like, letting go of what you think would be justice in the situation and leaving that up to God, but choosing to walk away lovingly. Check out what Peter says in one of his letters in 1 Peter chapter 3. He says, "Finally, all of you should be of one mind." In other words, be unified. Sympathize with each other. Love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tender-hearted and keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with what? With a blessing. Wow, that's hard. That's difficult, to repay pain with blessing. You don't have to continue to be friends with them, but that doesn't mean that you have to become an enemy. And if we can get that part right, sometimes friendships come back in other seasons. You don't want to burn bridges unnecessarily. You want to be loving in any chance you get. So being a friend means walking away friendly. So kind of as you process this and as we kind of wrap up, think about this question. What feelings come up when you think about changes in your friendships? When you think about friendships in your life that need to change, what feelings come up? Are you hurt? Is it anger? Have you tried to block it out? Are you confused? Or indifferent? Maybe you just moved on. But what feelings come up right now when you think of changes to your friendships? I want you to think about that. And I think really how we process that can make or break the way that we're able to still maintain healthy relationships with those around us, even if it means walking away, even if it means putting up some healthy boundaries. What does this look like in your life? I want to encourage you to take advice from Paul and from Barnabas, who chose to walk away friendly, who chose to, again, continue the mission of kingdom work despite potential disagreements with one another. Hopefully this can be a safe place where you can just kind of process some of that stuff and talk it through with your groups. I'm going to pray, and we'll be dismissed to our groups. And next week, we're going to be starting a brand new series that I really hope you guys come back for, because I think it's really relevant and really important to kind of think through some of the things we're going to talk about in it as we continue for the semester. So make sure you come back next week. Invite a friend, because we're going to have a good time. And I want other people to be able to have the same hope that you have, to have the same community that you're able to have, and for other people to feel included as well. So